All right, good morning, everyone. So what I wanted to do for our last class today before Pesach is maybe focus on an interesting theme of the Haggadah. Hopefully, did everyone get a sheet? I think if there are extras over here, if there are extras up front, if anyone needs. So to focus a little bit on the Haggadah with what I think is an interesting theme that hopefully will help to frame the Yom Tov of Pesach a little bit more for all of us. So let's begin with number one. So the beginning of the Haggadah. So again, remember we start Lachma Anya diachalu avasana ba'ared Mitzrayim. So this is the bread of affliction our forefathers ate in Egypt. Kol dichfen yesei v'yechol, kol ditzrich yesei v'yifsach. Literally translated, whoever is hungry, let him come and eat. Whoever is in need, let him come and join us for the Pesach Seder. Hashata hacha, this year we are here. L'shana haba ba'ared Yisrael. Next year we are in Eretz Yisrael. Hashata avdi, this year we are slaves. L'shana haba b'nei chorah. Next year we will be free. It's good, so we're all familiar with this, the beginning part of the Seder. So if I were to ask you, what's strange about this particular section, what would you say? What's strange about this? Yes? Excellent. So question number one is, what a strange invitation. Because remember again, when are we reciting Lachma Anya? When? At what point in time in the Seder are we reciting Lachma Anya? So remember again, you've already made Kiddush, right? So remember again, we're already past the first coast, because remember again, although this year, interestingly enough, the first coast is fascinating from a halachic perspective, because again, it gets into the interesting discussion regarding Yak Nahaz, Yain Kiddush Ner Havdalah Zman, which is an interesting discussion in halacha about the order of brachos. You have a lot of things going on. You have regular Kiddush plus you have Havdalah. Okay. And anyway, without getting into that, the point is that the first coast is Kiddush. So by the time I'm reciting Lachma Anya, so remember again, it's not just Kiddush. Remember, where is this in the Seder? What have I already done? Kadesh, Orchatz, Karpas. So already again, I'm into the Seder already. So it's interesting that when I'm inviting company, I'm already into the Seder. Good. What else is unique?
Why is it in Aramaic?
Excellent. Why is it in Aramaic? Remember again, there are two parts of the Seder that are in Aramaic. What are the two parts? Lachma Anya and? This will tell. This is very telling if you're awake for the end of the Seder or not. Chagadia, excellent, right? So it's fascinating that the Seder itself has bookends in Aramaic, right? Lachma Anya and Chagadia. Good. So we've got wine invitation now. Why Aramaic? Good. What else? Any other questions when you look at this? Yes?
What does it mean when it says this year we're slaves?
So first of all, what does it mean this year we're slaves, right? Again, we understand certainly there were times throughout Jewish history when that statement was unequivocally true. But what do we do with that, Baruch Hashem, in times when it's not true? Good, excellent. What else? Any other questions on this? So let's begin. So just to throw out a couple of other ideas. First of all, let's begin to tackle it a little bit. So let's get a little bit of the context. So first of all, the fact that the Lachma Anya is Aramaic, what does it tell you about this particular section? I'm sorry? When it was written. Or namely what? That it's an add-on to the Seder. And many of the commentaries of the Haggadah point this out, that it was clearly not part of the original Seder experience. Again, by the way, that's the same idea with Chagadia. What is Chagadia about? And you know what is that? I mean, I understand what it's about a guy who purchases a kid for 2 zuz. But what is it about? Excellent. So Chagadia is a metaphor for Galus. It's a metaphor for Galus, right? The Gedi is Klal Yisrael, and again, all of the next subsequent steps are the nations throughout history who have visited difficulties upon us. And that's why, again, at the end of Chagadia, which is why we end the Seder with Chagadia, right? Ultimately, again, Va'asa Kodesh Baruch Hu v'shachat Malach HaMaves, that the Ribono Shalom, the whole message of Chagadia is that as crazy as our national existence has been over the last thousands of years, Mashiach's going to come, the Ribono Shalom will set everything straight. So we know that Lachma Anya in its Aramaic form is also an add-on to the Haggadah. So let's talk about this a little bit. So it's an add-on. So what do you think? So now that we know that it wasn't part of the Seder, and by the way, I'll point out the Rambam in Hilchos Chametz U'Matzah has a nusach of the Haggadah. And it's actually fascinating because the Rambam has the nusach of the Haggadah as it was done during the times of the Beis HaMikdash, which is really incredible because obviously we know there was a Seder during the times of the Beis HaMikdash as well. You know, sometimes we think that the Seder was just a replacement for the Korban Pesach, but there was a Seder, Bizman HaMikdash as well, and the Rambam has the nusach, has the actual verbiage for that particular Seder. It's incredible. And you'll look at the Rambam and you'll see Lachma Anya is not there. Lachma Anya comes after the Churban Beis HaMikdash. So if I were to ask you, why is Lachma Anya here after Churban? What role does it serve? What would you say? We have an obligation to do what in the aftermath of the Churban Beis HaMikdash? To remember that we're in Gaul. More specific? To remember what? Oh, so beautiful. Hold on to that for just a moment. That again, we always try to remedy the sin aschino, which destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. Excellent. But before we get to that, so remember, we have a general obligation that whenever we experience simcha, we always remember the Churban Beis HaMikdash. This is the Arosh Simcha Si concept, we call it. That in order to show that our simcha is not fully complete in the absence of the Beis HaMikdash, whenever there is a moment of simcha, we always go ahead and remember the Churban. Interestingly enough, we think the paradigmatic example of this is breaking glass under a chuppah. Although I think we spoke about this, right? Did we speak about this in this class? Maybe it was a different year. That interestingly enough, that practice of breaking a glass under the chuppah predates the Churban. In fact, again, the Gemara Maseches Brachas brings down that originally used to break a glass at a wedding in order to temper the simcha a little bit. That when there was we just spoke about this, right? Right? With simcha and hololus. I think we spoke about this, right? So in order to ensure that simcha doesn't turn into hololus, they used to break a very expensive piece of crystal at a chasana. Interestingly enough, after the destruction of Beis HaMikdash, the breaking of the glass became also zecher l'churban. But in general, there's a concept that we always remember the Churban Beis HaMikdash whenever we celebrate something significant. Which, by the way, this is true of, for example, there's an interesting halacha, which is that when setting your table, we never bring out all of our finery, right? You never bring out all of your silver. You never bring out all of your crystal. You always hold something back. There's one exception to that rule, which is Leil HaSeder, which is very interesting. Very interesting. Leil HaSeder is the one night where you could bring out anything and everything you want, because again, there's a concept of chirus, concept of expressing our freedom. So in any event, we have an obligation to remember the Churban. So therefore, many of the commentaries on the Haggadah point out that Lachma Anya is there, zecher l'churban. Now, if I were to ask you, how is Lachma Anya zecher l'churban, what would you say? Yes? Excellent. So therefore, it turns out that when we say, remember, part and parcel of Erev Pesach was the shechting of the Korban Pesach. Korban Pesach could be shechted as of Chatzos, as of midday on Erev Pesach, and you could shecht it up until nightfall, shkia, not nightfall, but sunset, shkia. Now remember again, for Korban Pesach, you had to be part of a chabura. You had to be part of a group, right? And you had to be part of a group at the time that the Korban Pesach was shechted. So interestingly enough, the one thing that you could not have on Pesach night was last minute company, which is really an incredible idea. There's no last minute company on the night of the Seder because everyone had to be part of a chabura. So interestingly enough, many of the commentaries on Haggadah, according to Suli Rav Asher Weiss, Shlita from Eretz Yisrael, has a beautiful perush on Haggadah called Minchas Asher, and he discusses this concept extensively. And he says that Leil HaSeder, there's no such thing as drop-in company, right? It's not the pshat that you're in shul, you see someone, why don't you come join us? You weren't allowed to do that bizman hamikdash. Everyone had to be part of a pre-existing chabura. And if for some reason you weren't part of a chabura, there was no such thing as joining a chabura that night. If you missed it, unfortunately you missed it. So therefore some posit that this idea of kol ditzrich yesei v'yif, kol dichvin yesei v'yechol, whoever wants to come and eat, is a zecher l'churban. Is it a real invitation? It's not a real invitation. How do we know it's not a real invitation, by the way? So first, all right, who are you talking to? Who are you talking to? You're talking, remember again, this is, you've already made Kiddush, Kadesh, Urchatz, Karpas. It's not like you're going to the door and looking on the street and seeing if anyone needs anything. You're talking to the people who are at your table. The hope is anyone at your table has been what? Has been invited. Right? That would be the hope, that they're there with your will, right? They're there with your consent. So who are you talking to? So Arshavai is positive, this is not an invitation. This is Zecher L'Churban. What this is saying is, you know what's so tragic? That tonight, if I wanted to invite last minute company, I could do so. Why can I do so? Why? Because there's no Karban Pesach. And therefore, ultimately, again, this is Zecher L'Churban. So amazingly enough, when we begin the Pesach Seder, the first thing we begin with is Zecher L'Churban. The first thing we begin with is a remembrance of that which was. He then highlights another incredible idea, which I think is fascinating. He says that it's also possible, remember again, Aramaic was spoken even during the time of the second Beis HaMikdash. In fact, it was the vernacular. It was the common language of regular people. See, he says something so beautiful. I think this is his own chiddush, but he says that it's possible that the phrase Kol dichvin yesei v'yechol, kol ditzrich yesei v'yifsach, is what people would say Erev Pesach in the shuk. They would go out to the marketplace, and what would they do? Remember again, if you have a Karban Pesach, so remember again, and you need a group, right? You need a Chabura, because the goal is, ideally, you don't want to have leftovers from your Karban Pesach. That's the ideal. Right? So therefore, again, you want to have enough people that you could finish off the Karban. So what happens if I have a small Chabura? I have a small group. So again, what would I do? I would go into the marketplace on Erev Pesach, and I would announce, Kol dichvin yesei v'yechol, kol ditzrich yesei v'yisach. Is there anyone who is looking for a Karban Pesach? Anyone who needs to be part of a Chabura? Either way, the role of Lachma Anya is the same, right? Either way, at the end of the day, it is Zecher L'Churban. It is there to remind us of that which was. Either by lamenting the fact that I can invite last-minute company if I want to, or by going ahead and remembering that which was said in the marketplace of Yerushalayim on Erev Pesach. So a very powerful way to begin ultimately again the Pesach Seder. And I just want to point out, according to this approach, that halach ma'anya is the Zecher L'Churban. So you notice something very interesting. If I were to ask you now, how is the Seder structured? What's the structure of the Pesach Seder? What would you say? What's the structure? This is everyone's first Pesach. Oh, Hashem, good, very exciting. Right, what's the structure of the Seder? Steps, good, excellent answer, right? Steps. What's the flow? What do we start with? I don't mean like Kiddush. Like conceptually, what do we start with? So we don't start with Cherus, we actually start with Avdos. Remember again, Maschil Beginus u'Mesayim b'Shabach. The way the Seder is structured, and this is incredibly important because it helps. Sometimes we do the different parts of the Seder, but we don't necessarily connect the pieces into a whole. The Seder is a progression. So amazingly enough, what I start with is Zecher L'Churban, which is really quite fascinating, because the entire essence of Pesach, what's my obligation on the Leil HaSeder? What is my obligation? See Puritz, but even more so, what's my real obligation? Chayiv Adam Liros es Atzmo Ki'ilu Hu Yatsa Mitzrayim. The goal, the obligation of Pesach night is to see myself as if I left Mitzrayim. One of the ways I accomplish that is through Sipur, right? Sipur, the goal is not only Sipur, the goal is to see this experience as if it's happening to myself. So amazingly, the progression is quite fascinating. The first thing I start with, according to this approach, the first thing I start with on the Leil HaSeder is actually not Mitzrayim. The first thing I start with is Zecher L'Churban, which is really incredible. So the first thing I start with is, there's no Beis HaMikdash, and I yearn and I pine for the Beis HaMikdash. And by the way, that's why the end of Halach Ma'anya makes sense, because what does the end of Halach Ma'anya say? What does it say? Right? Hashata hachal l'shana haba ba'ard Yisrael. Right? So that's my goal. So remember again, I go from Churban, then I go into Yetzias Mitzrayim. Right? Then I go into the whole story, right? That's Magid. Those are series of time. Then I transition. What do I transition into? I go from Avdus to what? To Cherus. When does that switch happen? When do you flip the switch from Avdus to Cherus and Magid? Good. So it could be Hallel. It could also, on the most basic level, it's the switch to Matzah. Right? Matzah, at the end of the day, Matzah al shum ma. Why do we eat matzah? Al shum shlo ispiku b'tzeika, because there wasn't enough time for the dough to rise. So matzah is when I begin Cherus. I go Avdus, I go into Cherus, and then remember again, what happens then? Then I go into the meal. What happens after the Suda? What happens after Shulchan Orech and the Seder? What's the whole part of the Seder after Shulchan Orech? What is that all about? So yes, it's about Halal, praising HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But again, what's the avoda? Of course, to thank the Ribbon Shalom. But if you look carefully at the second part of the Seder, it's messianically oriented. So it's about Mashiach. It's about the future. Remember again, what do we pour right at the beginning of the last part of the Seder? Kosher Eliyahu. What does Eliyahu Hanavi have to? Again, in general, it's a kasha about what does Eliyahu Hanavi have to do with the Seder. Why does he get a cup of wine? And there's a whole discussion about this. What exactly the Kosher Eliyahu is doing at the Seder? Eliyahu Hanavi doesn't have a part in Pesach. You're right, Eliyahu Hanavi doesn't have a part in Pesach. Eliyahu Hanavi has a part in Mashiach. So there's an incredible progression. So we begin Zecher L'Chorban, we then go into Avdus Mitzrayim, we then go into Cherus Mitzrayim, freedom, we then enjoy our Suda, and then we speak about the Mashiach. But amazingly enough, what we just said, and then how does the Seder? And Chagadya, which is once again almost like a recap of everything. Chagadya is the story of Shibud, it's the story of suffering, the story of all these things, and then ultimately again, the story of Cherus. So I'm just pointing out how incredible the real progression of the Seder is. Yes?
Why don't we say that we start with Avdus Mitzrayim? We read the Karpas and Yachas by the time we get to Mani.
So there's a whole in general, why do we do Karpas? What's the message of Karpas? So good, salty tears, good. I mean, yes. But if you look in the Gemara in Arvei Pesachim brings down, I do Karpas. I don't know what. What's the real reason? That helps with the salt water. Why do you do Karpas? I'm sorry? How's the Cherus? So dipping, okay, good. It could be a tibble for free people, good. Why else? So bracha amar, but you could just as easily do what? Make a bracha amar later on. You can make a hadam amar also. The Gemara Maseches Arvei Pesachim says, actually today's daf and daf yomi. The Gemara says, Kedei shishla tinokos. The only reason we do karpas, says the Gemara, is to do strange things to elicit questions from children. That according to the Gemara, that's how we do karpas. Now the truth is, once we do it, we ascribe a whole number of various symbolisms to it as well. But I'm just pointing out, if you want to see from the Gemara, when the Gemara says that we do the tibul rishon on the first dipping, the Gemara says Kadesh Shulatinokos, just to get the children to ask. So yes, now Yachatz, you're 100% right. Can you say the break? But even remember again, what do we say when we do Yachatz? Nothing. Nothing. There's nothing. So I just want to point out, what's fascinating to see is, remember, we ascribe layers of symbolisms to all these things, which are incredible and beautiful. But if you peel it all back and you look at it, so for example, Yachatz, one of the reasons we do Yachatz is again Afikoman, but also Kadesh Yishua Tinochos. There's a whole bunch of things that are done at the Seder that Chazal instituted just because they look strange, because they're out of the norm, and to keep the children and hopefully the adults engaged in the Seder. Once we do it, we ascribe layers of symbolism to it. But if you think about it, again, the real kind of meat of the Seder, right? Like the substance of the Seder really begins with Lachma Anya. Yes?
Why do we say in Lachma Anya in the beginning that this is what we ate at Mitzrayim? We didn't eat it.
So this is excellent. So this is a whole discussion in matzah, right? Remember again, in the Torah, the first time we ever hear about matzah is where? First time we ever hear about matzah. What? Avram and... So does the Torah say they ate matzahs? No. Right? Remember again, Rashi brings down that it was Pesach matzahs. Again, all it says, Avram says, Lushi va'asi ugos. So Rashi tells us Pesach was matzah. Fine. The first time the Torah discusses matzah explicitly. So remember again, it's when HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives Moshe Rabbeinu the tzivui of Karban Pesach, And then Hashem says to Moshe, "Amatzah me'ochlu." So something fascinating about matzah is the most confusing entity. Why? Because we often think, and we say this in the Seder, Rabbi Gamliel says, right, why do we eat matzah? Because we left with such haste that there was no time to let the dough rise. There's only one problem with that, which is, as I just mentioned, the Ribono Shel Olam commanded us to eat matzah already on Seder night. Or we'll call it Pesach night. Right? There was already an obligation to eat matzah, or it's not the pshat that we were supposed to eat. We're supposed to take Karban Pesach on rolls, right, or on a challah. But it just happens, everything happens so quickly, we ate it on matzah. I'll just say something interesting about that in just a moment as well. Matzah was commanded by HaKadosh Baruch Hu even before we left. But again, even if we just go with the idea that matzah has its origins when we leave Mitzrayim, how does Lachma Anya say this is the bread of affliction that we ate in Egypt? We never see the Jewish people eating matzah in Egypt, so the Ramban says, an incredible Ramban, he says, we ate matzah for 210 years. Why? The best thing you could possibly feed a slave population is matzah. Why? Because anyone who eats matzah knows two things. Number one, it's cheap. Not shmura matzah like we buy. But matzah is inexpensive. And what else does matzah do? It sits in your system for a very long time. So, if you want to feed a slave nation inexpensively, matzah is the way to go. So this Lachma Anya captures the essence. I mean, the Lachma Anya is before the Ramban, but captures this idea that apparently we were eating matzah already in Mitzrayim. For 210 years we were eating matzah. The amazing part about matzah is that the bread of affliction, the Lachma Anya, the bread that represented our slavery for 210 years, then becomes the very physical embodiment of our cherus, which is part of the incredible yesod of Pesach in general, that which is bitter can be, the very thing which becomes bitter and represents your servitude, can become the very thing which represents your emancipation and freedom. Yes?
So why is it Hashem needs to tell us to eat our characters of matzah? Chances are that's if we eat them.
Because I would have thought without the emotional tzivui, remember again, by that time Klal Yisrael weren't slaves anymore. Remember, pretty much once the Makos started, we were no longer really enslaved. So I would assume that at that point in time they weren't eating matzah. They weren't eating matzah. They were probably eating bread, whatever they were eating. Yeah, so that's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to say, eat it on matzah. Just as an aside, by the way, I'll also point out, that their matzah did not look anything like our matzah. Right? See, how do you know that historically matzah was different? Remember again, so this is just as an aside, it's just fascinating. So we go ahead and we eat korech, right? Zecher lemikdash kein asa Hillel bizman shabeis hamikdash hayakayim. So remember again, how would Hillel eat the matzah? He would eat matzah together with maror, together with Karban Pesach, right? So we go ahead and we make the korech, we make the sandwich of Hillel, even though we don't have the Karban Pesach. What goes through your mind when you eat the korech sandwich? Right? Keep going, good, right? This is, who in a million years would ever put together a sandwich like this, right? You take one bite out of it, and what happens, right? The whole thing is a mess, it doesn't make any sense. That's because Bizman HaMikdash, they had soft matzahs. They didn't have matzahs like us. They had matzah that, for lack of a better term, was like a lafa. So now, by the way, it makes a lot of sense, because think about it for just a moment. If you have matzah, lafa matzah, and you have Karban Pesach, and you have lettuce, what do you have? Shawarma, right? But again, in all seriousness, that's how they would eat. That's how Hillel would eat Karban Pesach, and that's why it's called korech. Korech doesn't mean a sandwich. You know what korech actually means? It's a wrap. A kricha is a wrap. So Hillel, there was a machlokes had Karban Pesach, but Hillel would literally take his soft matzah, his Karban Pesach, his mar, which the Gemara says lechatchilas to use lettuce, v'haya karchan, and he would roll it all up together. And now the sandwich actually makes sense. Some Sfardim still use soft matzahs today. Ashkenazim, we don't have a Masorah for soft matzahs, so in general, better for Ashkenazim not to use soft matzahs. But again, at least Bizman HaMikdash, it makes a bit more sense how things were done. Yes?
So does that mean that in the Shema Yisrael that they all eat kidneys because their matzahs were wet?
Definitely. Kidneys, gibrats, those are, remember, kidneys, gibrats, those are much later innovations. Absolutely. There was no such thing as kidneys, Bizman HaMikdash. Gibrats is even different because kidneys is a halacha, gibrats is a minhag, but there was no such thing like that during the times of the Mikdash. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
So when did it become that matzah wasn't soft? Because we have them still in the mikdash.
When did it become?
That our matzah is not soft.
I don't know. I don't know at what point in time it switched. I don't know. I don't know. Look, it's also, I would imagine it's also harder to make soft matzahs that don't become chametz. But again, I don't know at what point historically that happened. I don't know. So anyway, so if we come back to Lachma Anya. So yes, excellent point that here in Lachma Anya we're calling matzah the bread of affliction, even though the same matzah later on and just, however long your Seder takes. But right, in some amount of time later on we get to Rabbi Gamliel, that very matzah is not the bread of affliction, but rather again, that matzah is the bread of redemption. So good. So now we understand that Lachma Anya's role is Zecher L'churban, and ultimately again, but remember, I was going to point out, in the realm of Beis HaMikdash mourning, there's two different things. There's Zecher L'churban and Zecher L'mikdash. What's the difference between the two? Zecher L'churban. We often use it interchangeably, but halachically they're actually two different concepts. Difference between them?
Something we had during Mikdash, something we do because we don't have.
Excellent. So meaning Zecher L'mikdash are mourning practices because we don't have a Beis HaMikdash. So for example, the minhag to leave an amma by amma square unfinished, which you see much less in Chutz La'aretz, but you see in Eretz Yisrael all the time, that is Zecher L'mikdash. Zecher L'churban, excuse me. That's to remember that my Kadosh Baruch Hu's home is unfinished, my home is unfinished. Versus Zecher L'mikdash are things that we do to awaken within us an anticipatory pining and yearning for the Beis HaMikdash. For example, the fact that we take lulav and esrog every day, where we take lulav and esrog every day, even though technically speaking, the mitzvah is only on the first day. That's what they used to do in the Beis HaMikdash. They would take the lulav and esrog every day in the Beis HaMikdash, but not outside of the Beis HaMikdash. We do that today in order to awaken within ourselves a yearning and a desire for the Mikdash. I want to just point out that Lachma Anya, interestingly enough, has a little bit of both. On one hand, it has Zecher L'churban. It reminds us of that which was done in the past. But if you look at the end, it also says L'shana Abba Ba'arad Yisrael, L'shana Abba B'nei Chorin, also has a little bit of that eager, anticipatory pining in Yirtzeh Hashem for that which will be. So two other pieces I want to highlight with Lachma Anya. If you take a look at number 3, so this is from Haggadah with the Perush of Rabbi Soloveitchik. So he writes over here something beautiful. I think he's actually quoting from his grandfather, Reb Chaim, in this. So he says something amazing. 3 Aleph. Kol dichvan yesei l'yechov. So he asked the question that we just discussed before. Yesh la'ayin lama maschilin es haggadah b'halach ma'anya ha'usekes b'achnosas orchim. Tezeh b'adai that mitzvahs achnosas orchim nitzvah gidolihi. Aval l'chora ein lo inyan l'haggadah. So Mr. Soloveitchik asked the same question we just asked before, which is, why are we invited to? We asked a little bit differently. See, we were asking, he's saying, Hachnasas Archim is incredible. Hospitality is exceptional, important, great, very, very important. But Lamaisa, what does it have to do with Leil HaSeder? We compounded the question by saying, again, what does this mean that you're inviting someone? At the end of the day, you've already started your Seder. You've already started the process. So if this was a real invitation, shouldn't you be doing it a bit earlier on? And the Rav says something beautiful. He says, skip down to paragraph Beis. V'nira Lomar, this is such an incredible insight. V'nira Lomar, dihine eved, eino yachal lahachnis archim. This is incredible. If there's one thing that an Eved can't do, he can't do Achnasas Archim. He can't engage in hospitality. Why not? Why not? He doesn't own anything. Remember again, to do Achnasas Archim, you must have possessions. Right? What does Achnasas Archim mean? It doesn't just mean inviting someone into my home. Inviting someone into my home is very nice, but it means giving them something to eat, giving them something to drink, sharing what I have with another human being, with another Jew. That's Achnasas Archim. And Rabbi Soloveitchik writes, he says, V'hal kaimalan, quotes the Gemara Maseches Pesachim, Mashe kana eved, kana rabo. Ve'ein la'eved nechasim, ve'gam ein lo bayis. So this is incredible. Remember again, there's a concept in halacha, even in halacha, of Mashe kana eved, kana rabo. Whatever a slave acquires, the master acquires. The eved, a slave, has what we call no kinyan yad. Doesn't have acquisitory powers. He can't own it. Why can't the slave own anything? Because he is a possession. Again, I want to point out, with this concept, this is a din in avodim kinanim, not a din in avodim ivrim. But nevertheless, again, conceptually, an eved can't own anything because an eved himself is owned. The eved himself is a possession, and therefore he doesn't have the power of possession. Therefore, mashe kana eved kana rabo. So again, an eved is walking on the street, he finds $100 bill, he picks it up. What's the status of $100 bill? It belongs to his master. Literally, again, he doesn't have, one of the most powerful kinyanim we have is kinyan yad, which means if I pick something up, I'm kone it, I acquire it, because my yad, my hand, is under my dominion. But an eved doesn't have that power. So when an eved picks something up, his yad belongs to his master. So his yad is an extension of the master. Rabbi Soloveitchik says something amazing. He says if there's one thing an eved can't do, it's hachnasas archim. So therefore, says Rabbi Soloveitchik something absolutely amazing. V'lachin, maschilim es hagada, b'achnasas archim, v'omrim kol dichvin yesei v'yechol. Excuse me. Tizeh derech chirus. Laharos she'im anu avadim ela b'nei chorin, she'anu machnisim archim. So Rabbi Soloveitchik says, you're right. What's the goal of this? The goal of this is to demonstrate our freedom. Right? That's the entire essence of Leil HaSeder. Chayiv Adam Liros es atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. I'm obligated to see myself as a free individual. How do I demonstrate that freedom? So the Rav posits, I demonstrate the freedom ultimately, again, by inviting guests. This is something I could not do for 210 years in slavery, but now that I'm a free person, I have the ability to engage in achnasas archim. Now, interestingly enough, so what's the problem with this approach? Right. So remember again, still I'm stuck with this is very powerful, but according to this idea, when should I be doing Lachma Anya? Right? Or if you were to play, right? Why don't you do it before Kaddish? Right? Again, remember, it's hard to invite people in the middle of the Seder, right? Because remember again, the Seder is a progression, it's a process, it's Dalit Kosos. So remember, it's important, the placement here is important. I've already done Kaddish, Orchatz, Karpas, Yachatz. Now the truth is, the Karpas, Yachatz, that's not really the big deal in this. The big deal in this is Kaddish. We've already started Kiddush. We've already done the first coast. So this is a beautiful idea. I'm going to do Achnasas Archim to show that I'm free. But once again, so why not do it before you even begin the Seder? So the answer, of course, is because it's not meant to be literal. It's not meant to be a literal Achnasas Archim. What it is a metaphorical statement. And I think what Rabbi Soloveitchik is saying is it's a twofold statement. Part one is that yes, I am free, and therefore if I wanted to, I could invite guests. But there is a deeper message. What's the deeper message? I think the deeper message is the definition of freedom. What does it mean to be free? According to this approach, what does it mean to be free? What would you say? To be able to give. The definition of freedom is the ability to focus on the other. You see, a slave is focused on one thing and one thing only, which is survival. That's it. It's just about getting through the day. The slave doesn't really have the capacity for chesed. The slave doesn't have the capacity for tzedakah. The slave doesn't have the capacity for achnasas archim. For one simple reason, not because the slave is not good chas v'shalom, not because the slave doesn't care, but because when you are fighting for your survival, every last bit of koach goes into that survival. The difference between avdus and cherus is the ability to go ahead and focus on the other. Have you ever heard of Viktor Frankl? You ever hear that name? Viktor Frankl was a survivor of Auschwitz. He's a well-known psychotherapist. Came up with a whole school of psychology called logotherapy. So Viktor Frankl tells an incredible story. He's a survivor of Auschwitz. So he tells that when the Nazis left Auschwitz, so they just picked up and left. There's just a whole bunch of people sitting around. This is before the Russians arrive, having absolutely no idea what's going on. Shell-shocked. Can't even imagine the korban, piles of bodies and a disease everywhere. So Viktor Frankl tells a story that they found like a storehouse with like clothing and stuff. So a bunch of survivors, they're there sitting around. They make a fire. They make a fire to warm themselves up. Somebody got up. He writes in such graphic imagery. He says, the window is cracked. Someone put a board on the window to just steal off the draft. They're sitting around the fire. And he said something amazing happened. Someone took out their bread and he began to share it with everyone around. So Frankel said, in that moment, I knew we were free. He said, because the law of the lager, the law of the camps, was eat your bread and eat your friend's bread too, if you can. The law of the camps was survive. Survive, survive, survive. That's it. He said, in that moment, when we began to share bread, he said, then I realized we were free. It's such a powerful idea because the slave is consumed by his survival. The slave is consumed by his survival. And therefore the slave has no capacity, but the slave doesn't usually have the bandwidth for the focus on the other. Therefore, again, the moment that I'm able to think about someone else, the moment I'm able to share my bread in Auschwitz, and the moment I'm able to go out and think about inviting someone into my home, that's demonstrative of freedom. But according to this approach, it's not a real invitation. And again, it's clear that it's not a real invitation. Because again, remember, if it was a real invitation, then what? Then again, you would be doing this at the beginning of the Seder. That's clear. So clearly what's happening over here is this is not a literal invitation, but it's a message. And what's the message? The message is the definition of freedom is the ability to live beyond yourself. A slave is egocentric. A slave is self-centered. A slave is focused on the self. A slave can't see past his immediate circumstances. By the way, what's the greatest proof that a slave can't see past his immediate circumstances? Even think about from Mitzrayim, where do we see this? That a slave can't see past his immediate circumstances? I'm sorry? So first, men didn't want to have children. Excellent. They could not see a future. Where else? Excellent. Remember again, when Moshe Rabbeinu comes with the message of redemption, what does the pasuk say? V'lo shamu al Moshe mikol tzurach me'avoda kasha. Someone comes and tells you you're going to go free. Someone comes and tells you you're going to have a destiny. You're going to have Eretz Yisrael. You're going to get out of here. You're going to build a nation. You would think everybody would line up. Sign me up. I can't wait. They couldn't. V'lo shamu. It's not the pshat that they heard it and they didn't believe it. V'lo shamu means what? They didn't listen. Or perhaps better stated, they couldn't listen. A slave is focused on survival. Get through the day. There's no more capacity than that. And therefore what the Haggadah is telling us is what's the true demonstration of freedom? The truest demonstration of freedom is the ability to think about someone other than yourself. Other than yourself. You know, it's an amazing thing. What do we do? There's a beautiful minhag at Leil HaSeder. Right? Who pours your cup of wine at the Leil HaSeder? Someone else. Somewhere else. So we like to say that, of course, it's because of cherus, right? I'm a free person, so I have a butler. Who's my butler? The person sitting next to me. So that's true. That's definitely demonstrative of cherus. But there's also a profound thing happening over here. I'm pouring you wine. You're going to pour me wine. We're going to do for each other. Because one of the most profound aspects of freedom is the ability to think beyond yourself. Slaves could only focus on themselves. The true definition of freedom is the ability to think beyond yourself and to think about the other. That's the kol dichtin yeseh v'yechol, kol ditzrich yeseh v'yifsach. I want to think about the other. I want to give to the other. And again, is it a literal invitation? No. But I'm making a statement about what it means to be free. And with my newfound freedom that I experienced at the Leil HaSeder, I'm going to make a difference, not just in my life, but I'm going to try to do something to make a difference in the life of someone else also. Because that's really what it means to be free. One last approach, and with this we'll conclude. I put actually the wrong source. In number 2, it's actually a beautiful piece. You could see number 2 is a piece from Rav Kook, Aram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, on the Haggadah. You'll look at that on your own. I want to share with you actually something a little bit different. So Rav Yisrael Meir Lau has a beautiful parish on the Haggadah called Yachel Yisrael. And he addresses the question that one of you raised, I don't remember who raised it, about what does this mean when we say, Hashata Avdi Lashana Haba B'nei Chorin. This year I'm a slave, right? Next year I'm free. Okay, that works well if I'm a slave. What if I'm not a slave? And again, he asks a more global question. Think about this case just a moment. We say two things at the end. Hashata abdi l'shana abal b'nei chorin, or hashata hacha l'shana b'nei Yisrael. This year we're here. Next year in Eretz Yisrael. This year I'm a slave. Next year I'll be free. What's strange about that wording? I'm sorry? So first of all, aren't we free now? Good, excellent. What else?
You said it so surely last year I was slaves again.
Okay, what happened, right? I said it last year. What about the good? What else? What about just the phrasing of it? Remember again, obviously the goal over here is to create a contrast. This year I'm here, next year it's Yisrael. This year I'm a slave, next year free. If you were writing it and you wanted to create a contrast, how would you write it? I'm sorry?
Wouldn't you write it the other way around?
In what sense?
Like, meaning, wouldn't you compare the bad and then the good coming after it? No, I meant to say, I'm saying it just would sound better if it was the other way around.
Meaning, put the positive first. Oh, good, excellent. What good? What about the year thing? If you were trying to create a contrast, how would you write it? In other words, why this year, next year? Why not what? Why not tomorrow? Right? Isn't the whole yesod of the Seder Yeshuas Hashem Kerevain? Right? I'm sorry? Why not tonight? Right? In other words, but even if you don't want to go tonight, right? Even if you want to give this year, next year, remember again, think about this just a moment. Right? When we think about the expectation of Messianic arrival, how do we gear our expectations for Mashiach? Achakelo, how? B'chol yom sheyavo. So there's an interesting idea over here that here we write, this year we're here, next year in Eretz Yisrael. This year I'm a slave, and by the way, you understand, of course, everybody is a slave to something. Everybody is a slave to something. Some people are a slave to their careers. Some people are a slave to money. Some people are a slave to technology. Some people are slaves to other people's opinion. Some people are slaves to the Yetzer Hara. Everybody's enslaved by something. And all of us are looking for emancipation from those things to which we are enslaved. But again, why frame it this year, next year? Why not go ahead and just frame it again now and tomorrow? And Rabbi Lau says something so incredibly beautiful. He says another message of the Seder, which is really incredible because so much of everything you need to know in the Pesach Seder is in Lachma Anya, which is really incredible. So Rabbi Lau says something beautiful. He says the entire essence of Pesach and the entire essence of the Seder is that change is possible. Change is possible. You know, you looked at the Jewish people who were slaves for 210 years. So to the average outsider, once we were enslaved for 210 years, what would the average outsider have said about Klal Yisrael? They're always going to be slaves, right? Once a slave, always a slave. Once a slave, it's 200 days of servitude, but something amazing happened. Change is possible. And the entire essence of the Seder is that change is possible. Maschil beginus. That's the bread of affliction. The Lachma Anya becomes the very bread of salvation and freedom. But Rabbi Lau says something so profound. Change is possible. But more often than not, although instantaneous change is possible, more often than not, change is gradual. And this is incredibly important. Instantaneous change is possible. After all, again, the Ribbon Shalom redeemed us in one night. That's what it means, Yeshuas Hashem Kerefayin. In one moment we're slaves, the next moment we're free. Instantaneous change is possible, but gradual change is more probable. You hear this distinction? Instantaneous change is possible, but gradual change is probable. And this is so incredibly important because that's what he says. Hashata avdi l'shana haba b'nei chorin. This year I'm enslaved. What am I enslaved to? Well, whatever, you fill in the blank. All of us are enslaved to something. This year I'm enslaved. In Meretz Hashem next year. Now, could it be that I become free in a moment from now? Is that possible? Is it possible by the time the Seder is over, I am free from whatever is enslaving me? Is it possible? Absolutely. Is it probable? No. Right? The probability is that in order for me to free myself from the things which enslave me, it's going to take a little bit of time. going to take a little bit of time. Is it possible that when I go ahead and I open up the door, Elionov is going to be there and bring Mashiach and bring back to Eretz Yisrael? Definitely possible. Definitely possible. Halabai, that's probable as well. But more often than not, change is gradual. Change is gradual, and change takes time. And Rabbi Lau posits this is the message of the end message of Lachma Anya. The end message is instantaneous change is possible. And after all, again, that's what we're celebrating on the night of Pesach. But more often than not, when looking at a model of change, gradual change is the more probable model. And this is incredibly important. It's important for us in our own process of change. Because so many times there are things in ourselves we want to change, and we want to change them now. And we become frustrated when I can't change it now. But we have to realize that on a personal level, change is gradual. And even on a national level, we've been waiting 2,000 years for Mashiach, and we will keep waiting. But change is gradual. That's the hashata hacha l'shana haba, hashata avdi l'shana haba. Instantaneous change is possible, but gradual change is more probable, both as individuals as well as a class. So it turns out that in this little paragraph of Lachma Anya, pretty much anything and everything you need to have a successful Pesach Seder is captured in this one paragraph. Number one, Zecha l'Churban. We remember that which we have, but we must always remember it. Every Arosh Simcha Seinu. We must always remember our Beis HaMikdash. Not to shed a tear per se, but to awaken within us an excitement. If you don't remember, you can't get excited, especially now that I described to you what matzah and what Karan Pesach is going to look like. It's going to be a shawarma. Right now, it's something even more to look forward to in Miras Hashem when the Churban comes. So number one, Lachma Anya is there to invigorate and to excite us about the Bayis Shlishi Meira B'Yameinu. Number two, Lachma Anya teaches us that the truest definition of Chayrus is the ability and the mandate to think beyond ourselves and to think about the other. And number three, Lachma Anya teaches us that as much as instantaneous change is possible, gradual change is more probable. All right, we'll stop over here. Wish all of you a Chag Kasher V'Sameach.